Starting in 3, 2, 1. Absolute free speech used to make sense in a world like in past times when you could only talk to your neighbors or those who you could reach, and you could only talk to so many people in a day. But the digital world means that you can literally reach anyone in the world and send as many messages as you want. That is terrible, like for many reasons. It's had terrible harms on many people. And what this means is that when the government sees that an act has an externality, they ought to tax it, they ought to intervene to deter this bad behaviour. That is what this does. Firstly, in my speech, I'm going to do some setup and then 3 arguments. Firstly, on how we reduce unsolicited messages that cause massive harm. Secondly, why we prevent the abuse of free speech. And thirdly, why good speech still continues. Firstly, on setup, and the first thing to say here is, what do these messages look like? We think that this is everything in the info slide, but there are 2 things that I want to point out. Firstly is those spam messages, like from scammers or from marketers, and then there are things like unsolicited dick pics, DMs from strangers on Instagram, all those sorts of things. And so what we also want to say here is that if someone is like on your friends list, for example, then we would assume that you would have already opted in. Obviously, you can still send friend requests without this, without incurring this tax. We think that that is allowed. But secondly, what does this tax look like? We think that this is not going to be like unbearably or extremely high, like probably a few dollars for a message. It will be to the extent where it becomes unfeasible to send these messages en masse from like a Markus or a scammer's point of view. But the third thing is that we think that in the status quo, there is no other way to opt out of these messages currently, because all you can do when you get like a message you don't like is you can delete the message or you can block the sender, but there is no way to do it proactively, and so we are the only solution that does this. So firstly then, why do we avoid these unsolicited messages? And the first thing to say here is that these messages cause like a lot of harm. A massive amount of the elderly and the vulnerable lose billions of dollars every year because they receive these like carefully constructed and elaborate scams from these scam artists who are often like overseas and hard to track down. And even though these scams don't always work, obviously they work in a minority of cases, when they do, these people lose a lot. And like we think this also includes like women who get harassed from like having to participate or engage in unconsensual sexual encounters all the time because they get these kinds of messages. This is so harmful. Why does this reduce on our side? Firstly, it's just that if it costs money to send something, then you as an individual or a business are less likely to do it. And I've already explained why this tax is likely to price them out. And note, this is particularly applies to people who send indiscriminate messages. This is like men who send dick pics, or like the scam artists and call centers in India. Because the business model of these companies is that they send messages en masse to many people and rely on getting a few hits to make those payments. We think that by doing this, we will like set the tax in a way that offsets this, so you can no longer profit from this. And we think that this changes the cost-benefit analysis in a way that this kind of scamming is now no longer a viable business model. This punishes the people who send the most messages. But thirdly, we think that it changes the social narrative. This is because that any government intervention or tax creates a certain kind of taboo, like it does with cigarettes, like it does with drugs. We think that this signals that the government is saying that this kind of thing is just no longer acceptable. But also, we think that these messages are now easier to track, and it is now easier to crack down on scammers and people who sexually harass women and those kinds of things. That is because we've assumed feasibility for this model. We think that you would have linked some kind of credit card or identification to your account, and we think that this means that it is now much easier to track them down. I think the impacts of this argument are very clear. Old people no longer lose billions of dollars every year. They no longer lose their pension. Your grandparents no longer lose their house. We think that you avoid all those harmful messages. And for the average person, who probably doesn't get scammed or doesn't encounter, who are fortunate not to encounter this, you no longer have to sift through tons and tons of junk mail. You no longer lose important communication from your work, from your friends, because it's all been crowded out by communication that you never cared about in the first place. We think that that is a massive benefit. But secondly, why do we prevent this abuse to free speech? And we would note that the principle for free speech, which opposition may run, is not absolute, but even then, we wouldn't really call unsolicited messages speech. It's kind of just harassment or nuisance, because you never really want to listen to what they have to say in the first place. It doesn't really create any value. We would note that this is really analogous to other limits to free speech that we already put in place. For example, like we ban hate speech because it incurs a serious societal cost. There is a massive externality associated with that. We would also note that you do not just have a right to say whatever you want like your ability to say whatever you want is also not absolute, and there are like structural reasons for that. If you want to, like, for example, start a blog, you need to pay money to register the domain. If you want to write a book to get a point across, you need to pay the publisher. Like, we think that, you know, there are limits placed on that. But even then, even if we assume that free speech was this like absolute good, we would note that we are no longer living in times where this is feasible, because you used to be limited by time, as in you could only speak to a certain amount of people in a day, and therefore you could only reach a certain amount of people in your life. We would note that that is no longer true in the era of the internet. And so we think that insofar as these unsolicited communications do not enable like the flowing of good ideas or do not contribute any value, we think that we would analogize this essentially to public nuisance, or how catcalling is a harassment. There is no reason to protect this kind of speech, and so it should end. I cannot stand in the campus of Melbourne Uni and shout whatever I want without incurring certain consequences, without potentially being removed by security. We think that this is much like that. But thirdly, why do we think that good forms of speech still happen? And so we think that this is like stuff because Negative may run things about why social movements will no longer be able to broadcast their movements and things like that. I think the first thing to say is that we think that you can still opt in to receiving these messages, whether it is like putting your name down for an emailing list, or whether it is like following an Instagram account like Free Palestine. And we think that people still have the option to participate in those sorts of discourses. But also, I would note that if a friend, like friends often like share these messages with you, and so like that is another avenue that people can still access this kind of information and still engage in this. But also we would note that this is potentially more effective where it is a friend sending it to you, because you are like more incentivized to pay attention to it, react to it, and whatever. But thirdly, we would note that in-person communication is still permitted of any kind. Like, we think that people can still just approach you on the streets. And we would also think that this is better because you have to converse with someone. You have to talk to someone about these ideas and engage in that kind of debate, which is so good for promoting these issues. And so we think that, like, compare this essentially to the really ineffective kinds of en masse messages that some organisations send. We think that our side is far preferable. But even if we accept the worst case scenario, like somehow the only way that these organisations, these charities could get to you was through unsolicited messages, we think that they do have the ability to absorb these costs, like they do have existing structures in place. But also, we thought that even if they could never engage in this, the harm was negligible. And that was for the reasons I said, because firms don't stand to gain a lot from this, because good movements very rarely use this kind of unsolicited communication, because they know it's off-putting, they know it's not exclusive, people are unlikely to engage in it. So at the end of the day, what do we see? We simply stop scamming all unsolicited messages. Good messages still prevail. This protects people. We are proud to affirm.
The affirmative team's entire case is contingent on the idea that this tax is actually a tipping point for the kinds of people that they want to stop doing this. But the issue here, I think, is twofold. Because in the first example they give of people sending unsolicited news and etc., these are the most morally abhorrent people in the entire universe, and suddenly a tax is what stops them from doing these kinds of things. People who obviously have the most misaligned intentions in society now are stopped by monetary incentives, unclear on why this is true. But also, that the other example they give are like scammers. Scammers have a lot of money because, you know, like they're like able to call a lot of people, they hire a lot of workers to call people. They obviously, the profit incentive is to do things. And if scamming is so successful as they want to claim, and surely the tax is quite minimal to them, because they know that even if they do have to pay this tax, they'll get returns for it. Then they say, like, oh, we can identify these people through this, through this. So can we. If they have fees to do so, then we also have the fear to have the technology to kind of identify when people are scamming or whatever. And so at the end of this entire first affirmative speech, the biggest impact is like, So the biggest impact is like you don't see spam. We don't have to have like the discomfort of seeing spam everywhere, which is something you already don't see because Gmail already like fucking filters that out for you and puts it into the spam section. I don't think this is a very large impact in this event at all, which means that at the end of that speech, there is nothing to stand on. Two things in the speech then. Firstly, the principle on why this is a tax on free speech and why it's incredibly harmful, and secondly, why it restricts good forms of free speech. On this principle of the tax on free speech, I want to note 4 things. Firstly, that in order to put a tax or restriction on free speech, there must be a very high bar to someone's speech. There must be quite a high bar because it's a fundamental way of people to communicate. And note that the analysis I give you on why social media is very bad is the reason why technology is the reason why it's really important to protect people's free speech. Social media has been a way to liberalize speech, a way to democratize speech, to allow people to come up with their voices which could not be heard otherwise. They have to pass an incredibly high bar of harm on their side to actually put a tax on free speech. Secondly, they need to prove an enormous amount of damage. Note that the examples they give are not analogous. Things like hate speech are very specific on the criteria used to determine what hate speech is. And the intuition part I give you is this. If it were feasible to tax people in real life on their speech, would you put a blanket tax on speech, even if some kinds of speech are bad? No, you wouldn't, because speech overall is quite good and quite helpful. Notice they need to prove very specifically why all of this kind of speech is very harmful and why all of it creates such a large harm. But also, at the point at which disproportionately affects poorer people, notice how tax just takes up a larger proportion of your income. This is a regressive tax, presumably. Tax a significantly larger portion of these people, poor people's incomes and large people's incomes. At the point at which you're taxing everyone's free speech or ability to speak, then you're disproportionately affecting poor people. The impacts of this are very, very, very clear. Firstly, that in our best case, this principle is just debate winning, because free speech should never be undermined to such a large extent when the harm is so unclear. But secondly, that it raises the opposition's burden on practical arguments. They need to prove why practically there's such a high bar for why this is a tipping point for why all of these people now stop speaking out harmfully, and which means the opposition's entire first speech just becomes a bit redundant. Under the second argument then on why it restricts good forms of free speech, there are 2 structural reasons I want to prove first. Firstly, that bad speech is more likely to have a stronger intention behind it. Hate speech is incredibly driven, whereas like sending an innocent DM is not as driven, which means that the tax disproportionately affects the people who are like less inclined to like send a helpful message rather than people who want to send a very harmful message, because there's a far greater intention for you to send that harmful message. If you were sending a dick pic and you wanted to send a dick pic, if you wanted to send a nice DM, then maybe you were okay with not sending that nice DM in the first place. But secondly, that better speech is more likely to be done by individuals. Corporations can bear these kinds of taxes. Individuals don't, and they don't want to spend. They don't like paying taxes. Individuals bear the brunt of this kind of stuff, and so I'll prove later why the individuals are really important. But now I just want to go through a case-by-case analysis of instances in which this is really, really bad and really, really bad to restrict certain groups of free speech, and why this cuts these people out. 5 different examples. Firstly, in instances of social media. Social media should be something that is free and accessible. It is through connecting and making friends that people have been able to gain a sense of self-actualization in the 21st century. But also, in particular, things like activism through social media. The 2011 Arab Spring was organized through things like Facebook, through things like unsolicited messages, which rallied attention and rallied support. But also, just like things like boycotts and activism and spreading information that's really helpful to the average voter. These people now stop using social media for these purposes because it harms the perception of social media as a free speech platform. It harms the perception of the freedom that these people think that they intuitively have, and harms their way of thinking. Secondly, is the example of small businesses. Note that larger businesses that are able to create massive amounts of advertising do so already, but it is the smaller businesses that require these avenues specifically to contact their base. 2 reasons. One, because they can't rely on advertising. These things are just out of their price range. Notice how social media and things like that are just free, which is really important for small businesses. But secondly, that you cater to local areas. It's also like putting things in the mail. It's also like doing cold calls and doing sales calls. These are the kinds of really, really important things that small businesses thrive on, because that is the only way in which they can get a competitive advantage against the large corporations that dominate them. And the harm here is just very, very clear, because even if the tax is low, they need to send out a lot of flyers and they need to send out a lot of emails, because even if they want to prove that the tax is quite marginal for businesses, no, it's not, because of the capacity that you have to be sending out these things, or at least lower the capacity to do these kinds of things, which makes them get outcompeted by larger businesses. Thirdly, there's an activism that isn't through social media. For example, like sending out how to vote cards and contacting politicians and MPs where you don't have the power to, when you don't have a lobbying power to in the first place. Notice how you can still access things like information on their side, because Also, they said that you can still access information by following pages. The issue is that people don't follow these pages because they have to see these pages to initially follow these pages and to follow these groups, which means there's a high bar in the first place, which means you have to be seen as a group first in order to get this kind of traction. But why does this cut these people out? Firstly, it's incredibly expensive. They have to speak to a large audience, which means they have to bear the brunt of a lot of tax that's piled up. But secondly, these are poor and desperate people, because the reason why they use DMs to message MPs and things like that is because they have no lobbying power to talk to them in the first place. This is a democratic principle we should protect in this debate, because it allows people who are poorer, who don't have lobbying power, to actually counteract those kinds of powers. Fourthly, is on charities. It's not just charities stop now. Charities are non-for-profit organizations mostly. They rely on every single piece of capital they get. Charities operate on sending out these kinds of unsolicited emails to people through their emails or through their mailboxes. They can't afford this now because they're non-for-profit. They don't make that much money in the first place. But secondly, is that even if they can pay for these kinds of things, you're taking just a large amount of money for all this money could just go to charity, which is a far larger benefit on our side, even if they can pay for these taxes in the first place. Finally, is on people that are job seekers, people who use LinkedIn, people who have to rely on cold calls to find jobs. Notice that if you had connections in the first place, if you were wealthy and privileged, you could just call friends and access jobs through those means. Notice how things like LinkedIn and things like cold calls are the only way for certain groups of people to find employment and to actually get employed for the reason. And now you're just taxing these people who are not only the most vulnerable people, but now you disincentivize them to actually try to find a job and make it far harder for them. At the end of this argument, you are to believe that this, at the very, very least, raises the principal burden the opposition has to cop, because it proves that there are lots and lots of cases, really important cases, where the most vulnerable people are fucked over by their model, which means that the principal part of freedom of speech has to be so large on their side that they outconquers this. But also, it just means that their side just contains lots of practical harms, which you also care about far, far greatly in this debate. That's why I'm very, very proud to get.
Yeah, people probably do have the right to approach me in public and be like, hey, you should believe my political belief. But if I say, no, sorry, I'm not, I'm on my way to something, they're not then allowed to chase me down the fucking street screaming at me. They're not allowed to chase me and be like, where are you going? Where are you going? Why don't you care? That's harassment, right? And we tell you that in the same way that you should be able to physically opt out of a conversation when you feel threatened or you don't want to speak to somebody, you should be able to opt out of all these things that are attacking you constantly on social media that are able to do this. And we tell you that the reason why there is an imperative to do attacks like this is because you can't fucking opt out of social media these days. If I wasn't on social media, I might have missed the boat party. And that's terrible, okay, right? You literally can't not be on social media. You can't not engage in all of these things. And this has to be, so therefore, at the point at which you literally have to opt in, there has to be some sort of counterweight to allow you to have a little bit of marginal easing as to what you actually have to deal with. So the imperative is that, but it is also completely blown out by the fact that we have technology now, which would just mean that it is just so easy. One person can harass maybe 100 people a day, but if I set up an AI chatbot to just take women's faces and make pornography out of them and spam them with that image, that can just be done automatically all day without me doing anything. It can be done en masse. There are hundreds and thousands of emails, millions of emails going out as we speak, which are just constantly harassing people. There is just basically unbridled harassment occurring. That is the imperative they had to prove why free speech assault employment actually still existed in this debate. So, let's do a quick moral sense check, then I'm going to talk to you about what attacks actually does, why this conversation is necessarily harmful, and then I'm going to do a response to free political communication, how we actually get better political communication, and then how even if our outcomes of vulnerable people are just so much better. So, moral sense check. I'm not allowed to pickpocket people. People aren't allowed to go and expose themselves to other people in the street. You're not allowed to catcall people and harass people. These are all morally abhorrent. That is literally happening online. There is no reason that they have given you why, like, saliently, it is like so different online that you should be able to expose yourself to people online and not have some sort of moral sense check. And we tell you that just because a tax might not completely remove this issue doesn't mean that that shouldn't happen. Which is to say that, like, the response to this is bad shouldn't be, yeah, but you're not going to perfectly solve the policies, let's just do fucking nothing. No, do something. All right, what do the tax do? Why is this conversation necessarily harmful? So they kind of try and get away with saying, like, that we have to prove that this messages are completely harmful. We tell you that to the point at which it is unsolicited and people are not opting into it, then, like, it will be harmful, because, like, it has never been easier to opt into communication. You can, like, follow the accounts you want to. It takes like 5 seconds to follow things you want to. People are innately curious about the world. People want to know what's going on in their local community. So to the extent that they are, like, actually opting out when it is so easy to opt in, like, necessarily must believe it to an extent this communication must be harmful, but also it's like sense check. Like, literally there is just so much harassment online, there is just so much bullshit online. So what does the tax do? Why is this a tipping point? They tell you that, like, basically this tax is just like so minor that, like, some people who are just like so morally abhorrent probably just like won't deal with it. Like, if I'm sending dick pics, I'm probably just like gonna cop the fine. We tell you that, like, there are lots of different people who are doing this social messaging, because, like, so many are engaging in unsolicited messages, and we tell you that, like, some people might just like not realize that it's like completely wrong, or might just like not realize that they're going to get like attacked, but also to the extent that which you are going to get fined for doing it, then you know that there is someone in the government who, like, knows your name, knows you did something wrong, and that is just like so much more likely to scare people. And we tell you that even if we get, like, I don't know, 1,000 people to stop like harassing people online, that is just such a beautiful marginal easing against like the most vulnerable groups of society. We would like totally opt into that, even if it's not perfect. We also tell you, like, large charities, large political issues are still like likely to like do unsolicited messaging, but then what they're actually going to do is, because like they're now having to like cop this cost, they're just going to make it higher quality. They're just going to make sure it's like actually going to get the message across. You're not going to get like those like 6-hour ads from like Clive Palmer, which looks super random. He's going to, like, I don't know, be concise. In a world where Clive Palmer says less, like, we win this debate, right? So that is basically, like, taxes are able to ease, they're able to like marginally gain that benefit, and some people will just like realise from the social messaging that it is not going to do it. Note they haven't really responded to our idea of like anonymity. So free speech and political communication. So we told you the test for free speech is like the point at which it begins to harm people. Like, you're not allowed to shout fire in like a crowded theatre. You're not allowed to like start harassing people or just like screaming at people, right? And we tell you that like the reason for this is that like free speech is like broadly an instrumental right. As in, like, we like free speech, not because like free speech is like 100% fine all the time, because like it allows us to like build up other political communications. And in a world we have no free speech, people just aren't able to like get across their political messages. And to the extent that like this is like broadly harmful and also like broadly ineffective, you shouldn't believe that like they have actual like genuine free speech in their world, or like genuine free speech imperative. So why do we get like so necessarily this is harmful, but why do we actually get like better free speech and better political communication in our world? 2 questions. Does this like actually happen? Like, I think that political movements broadly know, but if they're just like fucking harassing people all the time, people like aren't going to vote for them. Which is to say that like the most savvy political commentators around us, i.e. not Clive Palmer, are like realizing like just constantly spam texting people won't make them want to vote. Like, I'm just not going to like going about my day and then get like a text from Clive Palmer and be like, oh my god, I totally should vote him. Like, this is just like broadly not the way that political movements do this. They're more likely to communicate through news articles, through interviews which people can opt into, because they know that like people opting in means they're more likely to do this. No one's mind actually changed when it's what to say, whereas in our world, where you're just like getting less overwhelmed, you're much more likely to actually have like a better view of the political system, which is to say, when you don't feel like you're being constantly forced and harassed to engage, you're much more likely to engage meaningfully. In a world where you're being constantly harassed with every possible political issue, it is much more likely that instead of like researching into every possible political issue, you're just like going to have a more, like confined view. Like, you're going to care about the one issue you care about, and you're going to have like a lot of thoughts and like meaning about that. And which is to say that like in a world, like, it's really, really hard to communicate like the complex nature of like the Israel-Palestine conflict. And like, but if you're getting overwhelmed with every single message about every single political issue, you're much less likely to like care about any of it because you just get overwhelmed. So, what are the outcomes for vulnerable people? The vulnerable people in this world are like women, they're people of colour, they're older people, they're intellectually disabled people, they're people who English is not their first language, and they're less likely to pick up on a scam. I'm telling you right now that like, we're saying to put a cost on the people who are doing this, and in their world, the cost is just going to fall to these people, right? Scammers are able to just like push out scam messages again and again and again, and it only takes one vulnerable old woman alone in her flat suffering to like not realize it's a scam, or like one immigrant who doesn't understand like that word is misspelled and doesn't pick up that it's a text, for them to actually get their profit, right? In our world, 3 things change. Firstly, you're no longer anonymous. In order to be fined, and we like can assume feasibility, the government has to know who you are. It's like you have to like attach a credit card to your social account. You have to give some sort of identification. In a world where like you can't, like it's like your username can just be a bunch of numbers, and you can just like constantly fucking harass women. Like no one's ever gonna find you. You're never gonna like realize that your family and friends might realize it's your account, or like the government might realize it's your account, which means that we get benefits then. As in people like are much more bold when like no one knows who the fuck they are. And like we know, like right now on social media, there's just like so much fucking hate speech. That changes in our world because like we know if you're saying hate speech, we know who you are. There's also just like a massive social cost. Like people don't really give a fuck about littering before like you could maybe get fined. The littering fine is like so small, but like still, there's like a social issue of like you could be fined, let's not do it, right? And there's also like the actual cost. And we know that even if it is small, like people still have loss aversion, and people like you know, people don't like losing their money. Like there's a lot of loss aversion, and like it scales up. If I'm sending like 100,000 emails, then like that's gonna cost me $100,000. I'm not gonna fucking do it because like my at that point like the gambling of scamming is better. This means like people are much less likely to be like fished into like bad political movements like QAnon. It means that women and minorities are just gonna get less dick pics, less rape threats, less religious threat, and this is just like so much more important in a world where AI can do this automatically. So incredibly proud to propose.
You good?
Yeah.
I once joined society, a youth society, that was broke and struggling and needed to try and get some sponsorships. And the only way we could do this was to cold message on LinkedIn, cold email these companies, ask for a sponsorship and a partnership that could actually get us a connection, and this allowed us to get some money into sponsorships and to grow and give benefits to our members. Now maybe you may believe this one instance may not be as significant as their most extreme example they can give you, but it is an instant example how this team's case is actually very, very radical. They are in essence throwing the baby out with the bathwater when it comes to online discourse. Because things like forums, Reddit, TikTok, if it costs me $1 to make a comment, $1 to make a post, $1 to email a company or for asking information or what have you, that just destroys these platforms, that just destroys this access, communication, and messaging. And I think people currently engage in these platforms despite the risks they mentioned. Because I did want to go onto Reddit, I obviously wouldn't have to do it in the first place. I decided it wasn't worth it. So clearly many people decide it's worth opting in. And then this explains now perfectly how this actually is not analogous to the analogy they say, because they tell you if I want to string out harass, I can't run away, right? And I run away, that's obviously bad. Obviously, I can block someone, right? I can block someone, I don't have to engage on this platform necessarily. I can also make my profile private on those instances, which obviously that is the instance where this stuff happens. I can report them, what have you, get taken down. That is largely why I can opt out and say, no thank you, I'm good, the same way it happens on the street. That's perfectly analogous to the situation. Their principle does not stand in those instances, right? So, first I'm going to explain why I just think talk about the instances like which side do they get like less harassment, increase, what have you. Then I'm going to talk about I think our biggest win path in terms of all the things they have to kill in order to try and achieve their best policy. So they try and get this principle pushed by saying, well, you know, in the olden days, you know, it was free speech much better, you know, people, you know, what have you. Obviously, no, in the olden days, it was the wealthiest people who owned newspapers. It was political elites who dominated and controlled the radio stations that controlled permissibles for communication. I think democratization of political discourse, democratization of stuff, which is a very net good and probably is quite good. But in terms of discussing things like harassment specifically, right? First thing, no. Obviously, telcos, what have you, have legal requirements to block a lot of this stuff, and they're becoming stricter and stricter. That is getting much better. Secondly, they say they have ability to track it on their side and then tax it. Presumably, you know, so we explain this first in our response. This is criminal activity. If you believe it is criminal activity under their side, we can probably also track it and do legal enforcement. But no, we already do. They already go after like those many bank scammers. They're very significant. They track them down online. This is probably something we probably do on our side and the government already cares a lot about. So I think that is probably likely very strong on our side, able to do. And the third thing to note on this one is obviously no, it's like under their side, if this person, they say people make $100,000, right? Which obviously means a few dollars to them probably isn't the end of the world for, to say, one person, if the payoff is like $50,000. Same reason why drug cartels, right, cover a lot of costs in their shipping because the payoff for them is quite high, probably not as big a deterrent they want to talk about. So the fourth thing to note here, right, is obviously explain that obviously as type of communications just get a bit more sophisticated. They'll do things like those AI social engineering scams where they take someone's phone and they try and mirror them, right? Obviously it means it becomes much harder. Obviously probably means they do much more sophisticated forms of spamming, which are hard to block. So from things like AI, it means more people get impacted in ways that are quite vulnerable. Consider the classic kidnapping international student scam that was in the news all of last year, where they would say, call people pretend your child is kidnapped and use their voice through AI. That was quite harmful. So that explains why I don't think those work instances are likely to accrue under their side significantly. But secondly, no, obviously, there are things that are ways to block this that are very successful. Spam filters mean the cases of the Saudi oil embargo things is much rarer nowadays. Secondly, AI filters for things like news are getting much, much better and improving, which just an instance of these unsolicited DMs will just decrease over time. Thirdly, as I explained earlier, you can opt out, turn off many of these sort of things if you need to. And fourthly, and that is probably quite simple. And fourthly, most of these things like dick pics, what have you, often just occurs when you've already made a friend request, you've already connected. Say, on Tinder, you have already swiped, agreed to a connection, and then make this response. Presumably, if this exists under their world, that means it's probably largely somewhat symmetric. And typically explains the insufficient response, why these people already are quite bad. And what I do, obviously, doing things like sexual harassment already is something that's very criminal offense. And often, in many instances, it often just like risk your own social reputation being harmed. People find out who you are and what have you. Because many people already have many big barriers doing these acts in the first place. Probably means $1 won't stop them from targeting one person. Because those things they try and talk about and try and impact, obviously, they aren't mass spreading necessarily to everyone. It's often very targeted people that may, like people they essentially, messed up reasons, interested in what have you. What means they're probably willing to cut this cost in the first place. Which explains to you why things like Christian what have you probably aren't likely to meaningfully change your behaviour. And in any case, who's on our side is likely to be nowhere near as big as what it claims, and that is quite significant. I mean, the impacting here is obviously very significant, because that is their win path, right? They say we are going to crack down and stop these things, but clearly they don't much more than we do, and clearly the ones and most people happens anyway under their side in any case. That's a massive deal, and that's because of our clear conditions we tell you as they try and dismiss, explain how this cracks down and destroys so many forms of political communication and free speech and expression that I think are very valid on our side, are very important. So I think you have to weigh this very differently. They need to have a massive amount of change in these sort of actions, and they must believe it's massively, principally justified to do in the first place. They don't prove any of that if you're really convinced under that side. Let's now deal with their responses to our analysis we give you as to the benefits of these aspects, right? They give three main examples of the way to get around this. The first one is say some sort of emailing list to opt in. Well, obviously note, this presumably only occurs, I think firstly, if I'm going to opt into every charity, probably very unlikely, probably only say very big charities I've already heard about, World Vision maybe, probably very small, unlikely, that actually would probably do that, and at best case, maybe a general opt-in, which probably people are unlikely to do in the first place. Obviously it means that's very difficult, and obviously means I don't learn and find out about new information. Secondly, obviously note, thinking about activism is about changing hearts and minds. If I'm already preaching to converted, it's like activism works, right? If I already go to a social alternative meeting, I already believe social alternatives, I've already friended them, that's not what happens. The way discourse and protest movements change, I find out new information online, I make up my mind, and I get new information. That is how the process changes. I think they don't actually explain why knowing some friends, which is their second piece they give you, or what have you, or its third piece, actually meaningfully causes, allow the discourse to happen, right? Sure, maybe it happens on a tiny amount, but I think large-scale movements are quite bad. And final thing to note we explain, I think, insufficient response on this, is obviously just note, it is those with the least power, least ability to wealth, what have you, that lack access to these, education, right? So to be quite clear, people like Elon Musk will still do things like tweet his hate speech and what have you under their side. He doesn't care, he'll pay $1. It doesn't matter, right? He's already spent $40 billion to get deployed to a platform in the first place. That is symmetric. What happens on the outside is people who have good reasons. I am a charity, I am a small business trying to start something, actually get nothing. And note how actually that's a huge harm that actually is. Because I know it doesn't seem like it, but if I'm a small business online trying to make some unique clothes, what have you, and sell to other people, and now I just can't, it's hard for me to spread my business, make posts online, and actually get a traction, then obviously it's just very hard for me. And these emails and messages just actually means I don't get anywhere. If I'm trying to start a fun run or what have you, and I can't do it, then actually harms me and makes me a poorer person for it. I think you actually should weigh this very high in this debate, because it means I lack access to all sort of daily things to access to. What this means is the kind of loud actors that are very wealthy and obnoxious, they don't get. The kind of troll farms from like Russia state who will pay $1,000 to pay people to troll hate messages on their side, will still exist, paid as fine. It is innocent people who try to go engage in platforms in the first place who cannot under their side, and I think that's deeply regretful. They don't meaningfully change hate speech, what have you, and sort of other side. All they do is throw a baby out of the bathwater. I think it's a terrible idea. We are proud to have an online discourse that's democratic. We are proud to have free speech. We are very proud more in the gates.
First on harmful communication, then on beneficial communication. But before I do, a bit of characterization. Obviously, social media still exists because you can post to your friends, because your friends probably want to hear what you want to talk about. So all of that still happens. Social media still exists. Also, when you go, they say you can go to Reddit and TikTok and you consent at the point of that. But that is untrue because you need social media. Chelsea says you would not know where to go to the boat social if you didn't have social media because so much information, very important information, disseminated to it, which means that it's not true consent because you're forced to do so because you're obliged. So, first question, on harmful communication. What do we say? Obviously, intuitively, if you tax something, you raise the cost of that thing, which means that fewer people are likely to do it. And in particular, we told you that this is likely to stop two very harmful forms of communication. That of unsolicited dick pics and rape threats, and also that of scam artists. What were their response to this? The first push against people who send sexualized messages is to say, but these people are abhorrent instead, they are likely to be fine with a small amount of money. This is lazy argumentation because it just says all repugnant people must be fine with monetary costs. No explanation about why it's important, how this relatively weighs on them. I will do a much better detailed analysis, which is these type of abhorrent people probably have a couple of characteristics. Firstly, these trolls are often very lazy people on social media all the time, at the point in which you increase how much work they have to do to send this because it comes, for example, verifying the transaction, etc. That's something that disincentivizes them a lot. Secondly, these people are often extremely self-interested. Obviously they don't care about the other person receiving that information. That means why prioritizing, economic harm to them directly is likely to be, even if it's not significant, it's something that they still begrudge because they have to spend. Then they have to say, then I think the strongest thing is that often these people get off on very strong, the sense of power they can get at no cost at all, because they do this a lot, right? They say, most of the time this happens on TikTok, on Tinder, if you already swipe on someone. This is untrue. Lots of men send completely unsolicited messages to people who are not on their friends list. And the reason why you ought to believe this is just because lots of men are so terrible. They have nothing better to do with their time. They are filled with rage and hate, and they often get galvanized by online medias which say it is the fault of women that you, for example, have no friends or you live in this very sad life. Which explains why it is the case that they do send unsolicited messages. That was incredibly harmful. That was incredibly bad. But I think that on the second claim about scam artists, they say, obviously, scam artists make a lot of money, so a relatively small fine is unrealistic to deter them. We explain why this scales the most for scam artists, because you often send huge volumes, and it's okay for you to get occasional wins. We explain we penalize people at the point of them sending huge volume, need more analysis to outweigh that. But secondly, I'm going to explain to you why this increases the startup cost of scam artists. Because obviously, maybe for established scam farms, maybe they continue, but lots of the time, when these scam artists are starting off, it's a risk for them, right? They don't know if it's worth it, if it's going to pay off. That is fine for them in status quo because there's no very large cost to them. Maybe it's an opportunity cost. There's no monetary cost because it's just a phone bill which they already have, which is relatively small, etc. Whereas this is a cost, which means that it costs them more to start off scamming in the first place. The final thing is to say, filters are getting better at blocking AI, but obviously that misses our analysis where it's done by actual people. Obviously filters don't work for them. So, how would you weigh this issue? This issue is the most important because the intensity of the harm is very great. Because, for example, when you receive sexualized messages, that is a violation of yourself, your dignity. Women probably don't like that, and it harms them very concretely. You ought to protect them from that. Secondly, because lots of people, we told you, lose entire savings about this. Maybe the average cost of scams is small, but the individual cost for each individual person who was scammed is quite intense. That was incredibly bad. The second reason you ought to weigh this is because we owe an obligation to these people who tend to be vulnerable. That is, say, it tends to be the elderly. The state ought to protect them. It tends to be women, which are already sexually harassed in so many other ways. You have a unique obligation to protect these people. Thirdly, we say that the annoyance and inconvenience is large in scale. That was incredibly beneficial. Note, especially, I'm going to weigh this in a comparative manner. How will you weigh this against free speech? The first thing is, in the exact same way we ban Ponzi schemes, right? Like, or messages about financial like scams, we ban them in status quo. We actually also just tax them. And the reason why is this is a form of communication which no benefit is attached to, right? Like, lots of communication, maybe on average, is like kind of bad, but like has good parts to it. They need to explain why the good part, like the harm is so significant that maybe some people want to have more financial information, etc. But the people who lose so intensely that you ought to do it. That explains why it outweighs free speech. Now I'm going to move on to beneficial communication. The first piece of analysis we gave about this is just that the overwhelming majority of communication about social movements don't happen by cold calls. They happen by your friends sharing posts. You would still get all this information. That's the type of communication you're most likely to opt into and actually internalize, as opposed to us just all doom scrolling. Obviously, we just swipe past all the ads, we swipe past and throw all the junk mail into the bin immediately. They need to explain why any person engages with this, if it's not through their fans, through these channels. I think the strongest analysis was about small businesses. I'm just going to mitigate this to a supreme extent. Because it is the case that obviously you need to print your ad when you stuff it in someone's mailbox. You also need to pay someone to stuff it into their mailbox, which means it's just a trivial cost for this, because it's likely very small with respect to the actual infrastructure cost of going to a printing press and writing this out. But secondly, all the stuff about ineffectiveness I already talked about. But thirdly, I'm gonna flip this. And the reason why is because obviously the government gets the tax, right? And governments are likely to spend that tax on certain things, which means all the small businesses and large businesses have to pay the tax, and the government is most likely to spend that subsidizing small businesses or charities or stuff. Because even though small businesses spend some money, they get all that money back from the government directly, which explains, and also in fact they get more of it because the large corporations subsidize small businesses, subsidize local businesses. It is likely the case, for example, that local councils would waive this fee for if you're a small business within the first 3 weeks of starting up, because local councils often care about incentivizing small businesses. The second thing they say is sponsorships, maybe for uni societies that is good. But here I think obviously all my previous analysis applies. But also in particular, we explained to you that even if we cop their harm, right, about social movements and stuff, or about a sponsorship for small university societies, these are structures which have some kind of infrastructure behind them, right? There's some organization of a uni society, even if it's small. You can often apply for grants, etc. Obviously, often charities and also social movements have some kind of support about this, which means they're comparatively more able to absorb the harm compared to all the bad people we talked to you about, which are individual actors, which are going rogue, sending all of these very harmful DMs, which means the scale of this weighs less towards social movements. The final thing they talk about is LinkedIn and stuff. Obviously, sometimes you can just consent writ large, any recruiter can communicate with me, that is fine. I think at the end of this, you all believe that the harmful messages are so bad, they hurt specific individuals so intensely, that they outweigh very disparate, small scale impacts. Happy to propose.
I'm going to start by explaining why that case shows that third affirmative cannot be credited. Because firstly they say, well, we're going to use this tax for subsidies for things like charities and small businesses. By the rules of debating, you cannot run a model at third affirmative. And then secondly, they say, well, we're not going to apply this tax to charities and small businesses. Well, no. Again, you cannot run a model at third affirmative. But also, if you read the topic, the topic says we're going to apply it to all forms of unsolicited communication. You can't, even if you ran first, you couldn't run this as a model. Alright, I'm going to defend our principle, then I'm going to explain why we did win the practical clash. Their only real response to our principle is to say, well, this is, the analogies like hate speech, in-person harassment, these things are absolutely abhorrent. The reason that this does not get over the bar to restrict speech is that this is a universal restriction of speech. So, saying that, oh, we're going to restrict all unsolicited contact because it could be harassment is equivalent to saying we would tax all speech because some of that speech might be hate speech. But we only restrict speech when we can specifically apply it to certain cases where that is bad. You cannot have a universal restriction in the case it might be bad. We asked this affirmative team at first: would you tax all speech in the case it might be hate speech? Their faces right now say no, but the logical extension of their case is yes. That is why our principle still stands. They say, well, we have obligations to vulnerable people. We think this is practically contingent, but our principle, notably, is not practically contingent. We would say it is a moral bad. Firstly, I think this is inherently debate-winning. But secondly, it at least raises their bar in the practical clash. Because we prove it is such a high bar to restrict speech, then they must prove they meet this bar and they win the practical clash so overwhelmingly. So, I think on the practical clash, this debate is probably just like, well, they think they restrict some forms of bad speech. We think this restricts some forms of good speech. So I guess it's kind of a deadlock. I'm going to break the deadlock in 3 ways. The first thing I'm going to do is say, well, these bad cases do not apply to the debate, but ours do. And we tell you this at bed. We say that fiat is symmetric, and that assuming feasibility means that you can identify every case where this happens, and notably First Staff himself uses this mechanism. At First Staff they say, well, the ability to tax means that we can identify and do things like police reporting. So because they did it, we can do it too. We tell this at Ben. We told you this at James as well. These things they're describing are criminal, right? At the point at which the affirmative team's analysis and assuming feasibility, the rules of the debate, imply that we can identify all these cases, these things are illegal. Harassment is illegal. Scams are illegal. Sending dick pics is illegal, right? These things do not simply apply to the debate because in this world, which we are assuming, we can simply not do these things. They never responded to this in third affirmative. We told you it down the bench. So, I think that breaks the deadlock. The second way I'm going to break the deadlock, because good forms of contact are more likely to be affected by this tax than bad ones. For 3 reasons. Firstly, because we think both teams identify people just generally don't like losing money. So if your intention isn't I guess that strong, then you probably just stop doing the contact. But I don't think it stops people with very strong intentions, like harassment. And the intuition here is that people who harass people undergo much greater harm to themselves than the tax, right? A, they risk their social reputation. But B, they risk police action and legal action against them, right? So why is the tax the tipping point for why you don't do these things when you undergo much greater harm to yourself? Third half characterizes people as lazy. They want a sense of power. They have all these incentives to do this. They give us the analysis why harassment won't change. So I think secondly, because I think their tax is more likely to stop large-scale contact rather than small-scale contact. So it's more likely to apply to charities, small businesses, political activists, public posts on social media than things like just one-on-one harassment, because it's a far greater cost when you're doing it at a wide scale than when you're doing one-on-one harassment. Third reason is that you only have to pay it one time in these kind of bad cases, because if you're going to harass someone, you just pay it once. But things like small businesses and charities, they pay an ongoing cost, so they're far more likely to opt out. So I think this proves why the bad cases they're talking about still exist for this tax, but the good cases do not exist for this tax. So we break the deadlock through that symmetry. Third half says that, well, perhaps it's a trivial cost of business. They have to do things like printing 2 responses. Firstly, not true. They have to do things on a very large scale. But secondly, and I think this is the nuance of the analysis we give at James, it doesn't affect the richest businesses, but it affects smaller businesses, and it affects the businesses we care about most. It affects charities, it affects NGOs, it affects local businesses that need to do these things because they cannot afford large-scale advertising, and because they're advertising to a local community. But notably, even if they do the same thing, even if they still do this, you're just taking money from charities. You're taxing charities, and you can't give it back to them because you can't run a model at third act. So, second act says, well, things like harassment are also done at a large scale, like, for example, creating porn. 3 responses. Firstly, these scammers, I think, are easy, like, large-scale scammers are easily found and blocked out. Secondly, I think this is not particularly common because you're more likely, it's more likely to be someone you know, because this is such an abhorrent thing to do. I think there's a very strong intention to it, so it has to be someone you hate, or maybe you want to impress, or just some like interpersonal reason. I think at the end of this, I think we prove that their bad cases are symmetric, the good cases are not. That's why you care about them more. But the third and final way I'm going to break the deadlock is just to say that the good forms of contact are more important than the bad ones. They say, well, you can still access our good forms of contact. Firstly, you can sign up for an email list. We think this email list necessarily has to be like a universal one because you can't consent to every individual businesses, right? Like every business in existence. It's impossible, and people aren't going to sign up to the general email list, right? Even if they might want a charity to contact them. Secondly, they say, well, you can follow an account on social media. We rebut this at Ben to no response. Like it has to be changing hearts and minds that you from posts that you don't follow and accounts that you don't follow. Thirdly, they say we can do in-person communication. We rebut this at Ben to no response. Like this doesn't work for the things we're talking about. I think the reason our things are more important are firstly, you can just avoid the things they're talking about. Like there are inbuilt protections within social media, like things going your message requests, not your messages, or blocking scammers, or reporting people so they won't happen in the future. There are inbuilt protections. Secondly, you can just block the person. But I think the second reason why I think is more important is that good cases occur at a larger scale than bad ones. Charities affect every vulnerable person in a country. Political action affects the entire country. These changes are the most important in the debate, and they apply to far more people. At best, they prove a harm to individuals, but we prove a benefit to entire societies. Second act says that no one's heart is changed through through this type of action. 3 ways it is. Firstly, it lets people know that these things exist. For example, it lets you know that a small business exists. Secondly, it reminds you to engage with them. So maybe you care about charity, but you kind of forget about it, but actually getting this kind of contact means that you do engage with that. But thirdly, it just gives you more information about that thing. So for example, it gives you a how to vote card. It tells you more about the political candidate. Second act also says, well, it forces these businesses to make it high quality. I think firstly, they already have incentives to make it high quality, so you can't go any further. But secondly, I think quantity is more important because it's more important you reach just kind of more people for things like charity, for things like political action. And thirdly, you're still taking money from important businesses. I think we win, firstly on fiat, because we can do the things they can do. It's political act, it's a police matter. Secondly, it's more symmetric. Thirdly, it's more important.